In Genesis chapter 7, Noah finishes the ark. And throughout the entire building process, there's one thing that God never actually told Noah. In fact, God waits until they're 7 days away from the flood to tell Noah this one detail. There's also one specific thing we all want to know, but the story never answers our curiosity. And I believe there's a reason for this. See, these kinds of details bring out the deeper treasures within this very familiar story. So let's jump into Genesis chapter 7, verse 1 through 3. Genesis chapter 7, verse 1, it says, "Then the Lord said to Noah, 'Go into the ark.'" Now, the verse before this, Noah did everything that God had commanded him. And that's going to be a repeating statement throughout Genesis chapter 7. Pay very close attention to those when you see that statement. "Then the Lord said, 'Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I've seen that you are righteous before me in this generation.'" Two key words. If I were to summarize this chapter in two specific words, I might use the two words I would use for Genesis 6, which is destruction and preservation. There are two other words I might use to capture this chapter, which is the word taken and the word left. The word taken and the word left. To summarize this chapter, Noah finishes the ark, and 7 days before the flood, God tells Noah to bring his family and the animals into the ark. God brings the flood waters onto the land to destroy all life, and the waters prevail for 150 days. If we break this chapter down into three segments, you'd see verse 1 through 5 being the first one, where God instructs Noah what to do next now that he's built the ark. In verse 6 through 15, you'll see the second section where Noah and those with him go into the ark, and the floodwaters come. And then the last section we can break this chapter down into is verse 17 through 24, which is where the floodwaters come to destroy all life on the land. Some key words to pay attention for when we read this chapter. Words like animals, ark, command, commandments, the earth, the land, the ground. The number 7, rain, waters, birds, beasts, or livestock, entering into or going into, and then the word prevail. Some key ideas to pay attention to, apart from the key words, and if I were you, I'd take note of these things because you're going to see this story from with a new perspective after knowing what to look for. Key ideas to look for in this chapter: Noah's obedience, God's commandments, the floodwaters being released, entering the ark, Noah taking with him, prevailing waters, and then the 40-day and 40-night idea. Some brand new ideas we have not seen yet are the 40-day and 40 nights, clean or unclean animals. This will be the first time we see that explicitly, that terminology. And then God shutting in. We've not seen that yet. Some ideas that we're going to see in this chapter we've already seen in the previous chapters of Genesis. Waters covering the ground, the land and the mountains. One human that's set apart. God sovereignly ruling over the waters. God preserving and protecting life. The seventh day being significant, God giving commands, mankind, animals, birds, and creeping things. Altogether, we'll see the breath of life being in the nostrils of creation or creatures. And then we'll see the concept of entering into sacred space that God has marked. Entering into sacred space God has marked. So looking at verse 1, I'm just going to make some observations for this first episode here in Genesis chapter 7. This verse right here, where it says that the Lord said to Noah, right? It's going to be reminiscent of verse 22 in chapter 6, where God commands Noah. And what you're going to see is that Noah is going to go into the ark. In other words, Noah is going to do all that God commands him. This verse follows the fact that Noah did all that God commanded him, and God responds. I want us to pay very close attention to the transition between chapter 6 and 7. Noah does all that God commands him, builds it. What's interesting is the text never explicitly says, it's just assumed, but the text never explicitly says Noah finished the ark. It just says Noah did all that God commanded him. And that's an interesting way to say Noah finished building the ark instead of just saying he finished. And then the Lord said, to follow up and respond to what Noah has already done, God responds to Noah's faithfulness. Noah doing all that God told him to do is what moved him and his family to the place where God would say it's time to go into the ark. In other words, Noah doing all that God commanded him is what moved him into the next phase of his life and calling and the plan God had. And that's interesting to note, very important. That's just how life will work sometimes. God only told him what to do next because Noah did what God said to do first. So God's timing and his instruction to go into the ark, that all depended on Noah actually doing what God had said prior. Do the first thing I told you to do, and then God's going to tell him when to go into the ark. Noah did not know when he'd finish the ark. There's no clear timeline, or there's no clear deadline. There's no, Noah, you have to have it done in this amount of time. God just says the floodwaters are coming, build the ark. Noah didn't know when he'd finish or when he'd go into the ark. But once he finished his task, God actually gave him the information that he didn't have prior and then provided him the next step. Now, this is what it looks like for the Word of God to be a lamp unto our feet, or for God to direct our lives, is sometimes God just lights up just the next step. And it's on us to just do what God has told us to do. And whatever information we don't have, whatever is uncertain about the next few steps, God will clarify as we step forward in obedience. Not to insert ourselves into the text, but to say there's wisdom in the way that Noah conducted himself. There's wisdom to draw from the way that God responds to Noah's faithfulness. And so that's important to note, because some of us are in that season, that specific situation in life. Also, again, we aren't told how long it took for Noah to complete the ark. A question I have is, why does the text tell us how old Noah is when he has kids? If you go back to chapter 5, verse 22, it tells us Noah's 500 years old when he ended up having kids. And the text doesn't shy away from telling us how old Noah was when he had kids. And even when the floodwaters come, you'll see in verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. But the text never tells us when Noah started, or even when Noah necessarily finished. Well, I guess you could subtract and go, he was 600 in the second month, but the text never tells us when Noah actually started. And then we also see that Noah never knew the details. At least the text never gives us any statements about God telling Noah, hey, here's when you can expect to go into the ark. We see Noah building and finishing and completing, and then after that, God tells him, go into the ark now, you and all your household. We don't see that information prior, and that's, to me, fascinating, that Noah spent all that time building the ark without even knowing when it was time to go in. Obviously, when it was finished, but how long would there be a gap between finishing and entering? We don't really know, because it doesn't tell us when Noah exactly finished or even started building the ark, and there's no, I don't know. What might be revealed to us about this story as we think about that, how Noah's life, we're told how old Noah is when the floodwaters come. We're told how old he is when he has kids, but we're not told how old he is when he starts the ark. What might be revealed about this story, and even the deeper message, by the fact that the author doesn't include those details. So when we look at a lack of details and we go, I really want to know when in fact did Noah start? When in fact, tell me when he finished, how long did it take? When those details aren't contained in the story, and we notice that, there might be something to the fact that those details are left out. Noah's lifespan is marked and referenced by when he had kids and when the floodwaters came. These would seem to be the milestones of Noah's life, the time markers of his life. His life years are not measured by when he started and finished the ark, rather offspring and salvation. The floodwaters coming and Noah being preserved in the ark, and then Noah having kids, having offspring. Offspring and salvation mark the key moments of Noah's life. And I just want us to reflect on that and meditate on why that is. Rather than what Noah built, rather than what Noah completed and did and finished, it's about what God gave him. God gave Noah offspring. God gave Noah a future. God gave Noah salvation, of course, through his faithful efforts to actually do what God said, but it's God who provides and the results that Noah experiences. Also, when we look at the fact that God tells Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, I've seen that you are righteous in this generation. I'm just going to highlight that in green because I think that's very important. And God says, I've seen that you are righteous. How long did it take for Noah to finish the ark? Again, back to the fact that we don't have that information. Why aren't we told that? We can do the math and kind of add up the years of his son's lives and get a rough estimate, but not an exact year. And also, why did Noah have to wait for the instruction to go into the ark? If Noah is righteous in the sight of God in this generation, and God is working with him, partnering with him, choosing him for something special, why did God leave out the details of when it was time to go into the ark? How long did Noah have to wait until he knew when it was time to go into the ark? Just questions I have that I don't think we can get an absolute answer to, but as we meditate on that and think about why Noah might have had to wait, or why Noah didn't have the details, it might bring us closer to, or give us a better understanding of how God works in the world and in our lives. Also, when God says that Noah is righteous, God doesn't necessarily say that Noah's family is righteous. He says, I've seen that you personally are righteous, Noah. So go into the ark, you and all your household. There's something about the household joining Noah because Noah's righteous. So the text, God explicitly says, Noah, you're righteous. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they're not righteous. I want to make that very clear. Just because it doesn't say they are righteous doesn't mean they're not. But why would this passage not mention anything about their righteousness? Why emphasize Noah's righteousness as being a standout fella in that generation? And God doesn't directly command Noah's family. If you think about it, God doesn't tell Noah's family. He tells Noah to bring his family into the ark because he's seen that Noah is righteous. There's something about God's instruction and conversing with Noah that is connected to Noah being righteous in his sight. Noah having this unique communication line with God and having this special information about what's coming and what Noah should do, that's all based on God has evaluated Noah to be righteous. And I just find it interesting that God references the generation of Noah and how Noah is a standout figure of righteousness in that generation. Why does God mention the generation, that generation, as a reference point for Noah's righteousness? When we're trying to figure out how righteous is Noah, well, he says, in this generation, Noah, I've seen that you're righteous. Why is that a reference point for Noah's righteousness? If God mentions an entire generation, and then he says, I've seen, evaluated, tested that you're righteous, Noah, might we conclude that God was actually looking for anyone righteous in that generation, but God just found Noah? He only found Noah. Or is it that God arbitrarily chose Noah and decided, you know what, you're going to be righteous in my sight, independent of what you've done, independent of who you've been historically. Noah, I'm just randomly deciding you're righteous in my sight apart from everyone else. Is it that God arbitrarily decides Noah is righteous? Or is God looking for people in that generation who he would deem, consider to be righteous to work with, and he only finds Noah? Because often there's a lot of assumptions we can bring to the text where it's like, no, God, the grace, I'll say it like this. Noah being chosen started with God's grace. And I don't think any of us would argue with that. All of this starts with God's grace to do anything good for Noah and for the world at large. But for the reason God chose Noah, is it purely, utterly nothing but the grace of God? Or is the grace of God extended to Noah not partially, but also because of the fact that God has seen Noah historically to be and do righteousness? Not saying he's perfect, not saying he's without moral failure, but in the sight of God, he is deemed righteous. Did God randomly just choose a guy? Who can I pick? Or is it that Noah was truly, historically, up to that point, the majority of his life was, lived in honor and fear of the Lord, and God sees that and chooses to work with him? Because there are different perspectives to bring to the text based on how we understand salvation and God's grace. And again, God doesn't explicitly instruct Noah's family to go into the ark. He tells Noah to tell his family. God doesn't directly come to Noah's family. And the question becomes, why might have God done it this way? And I know for some of us, the questions I'm asking and the details I'm pulling out might be useless in your sight, or might, you go, this is literally nothing. There's no reason we should examine these details. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. There's no reason to dive this deep. You're making something out of nothing. I don't believe so. I think the way God is conducting himself with Noah and Noah's family and what God says and what God does is, if you actually examine it on a deeper level and examine it in light of the rest of Scripture, you might come to some pretty fantastic conclusions about who God is and how he works. For instance, the idea that God directly tells Noah to bring his household instead of talking to the family, and the fact that God doesn't explicitly say his family is righteous, it just speaks to the fact that God is gracious to allow his favor and grace on one to be extended to those who are attached to that chosen one. And I think that gives us an image of Jesus. Also, if there's no clear statements about Noah's household being righteous, why does God allow them to be saved with Noah on the ark? What does that sound like? If they are not to make an argument from silence and say they're not righteous, but if the text doesn't tell us they are, but Noah brings them into the ark to be saved with him, even though there's nothing about their inherent righteousness, what does that actually sound like? I think it sounds like Jesus bringing us in to what he's accomplished and done and won for us. Also note the distinction, once again, between being in this generation, but at the same time, Noah is righteous in the sight of God. When God says, I've seen you're righteous. There's something to be said about Noah being in that generation, but he's distinct from the people of his day. He stands out as fundamentally different. God doesn't tell Noah when to go on the ark. Once again, he tells Noah when the flood is coming. Go into the ark. I've seen that you're righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also. I have some questions about this. Male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I'm going to send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So God doesn't tell Noah necessarily when to go into the ark. You might read this right here, this instruction, go into the ark, as a general do it now. But there's no, you can't see it, as do it now, but there's no clear time markers attached to it. Do it. It just says go into the ark. And what you're going to see is the text seems to indicate that Noah and his family don't go until the actual day the flood comes, the 7th day. And I had to do some reading around and going, why does it seem like they do wait until the 7th day? And at the same time, Noah is said to do all that God commanded him. Once again, we'll see that in verse 5. So it's not that Noah disobeyed God, if indeed he waited till the 7th day to bring his family into the ark with the animals. That was still deemed obedience to God because there's no clear time markers on when to go into the ark. There's no, deadline. God didn't tell Noah when to go in the ark. At least we don't have that information. He tells Noah when the flood is coming. But it seems as though Noah won't enter the ark until the same day of the flood. If you look at verse 13, read ahead. We can assume no matter what, Noah actually did what God commanded him and obeyed. Also, this concept of clean versus unclean really gets people wondering. At this time, there's no Levitical system set up. There's no commandments from God. There's no instruction through Moses. There's no Levitical law as it relates to the sacrificial system and what's clean, what's unclean. So the question I have is, was there a concept prior to this of clean/unclean animals in Noah's day? Was that a culturally understood idea? Or is this the author of Genesis looking back in hindsight with an understanding of Torah, and he's referring to the animals Noah brings as being clean versus unclean? In other words, is he looking back in hindsight with understanding of Torah, looking at the animals Noah chooses to bring 7 pairs of that and go, oh, those were clean animals, and God told him to bring clean animals? Is the understanding of clean, unclean going to be different or nuanced in the days of Noah? Would being clean mean the same thing to them, or would it be a little different? And I know some of you would say, why would it be a different idea? Why would it carry a different meaning? And that's exactly what I'm asking, is not just why might there be, but is there potentially? And in verse 2, why didn't God give this information to Noah in chapter 6? If you read chapter 6, God tells Noah how to build the ark, what to build it like, what it's going to be like. God says nothing about clean or unclean animals or bringing specifically 7 pairs of all clean animals, which we go, why 7 pairs of clean animals? He doesn't reveal that information until Noah's about to enter into the ark. So there's that aspect of Noah didn't know that information, or at least we don't have that explicitly stated to Noah until now. Also, why 7 pairs? Why only, of the not clean animals, why only 1 pair right here? And a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate. And 7 pairs of what? Of the birds. So why are there 7 pairs of birds, 7 pairs of clean animals, and only 1 pair of the not clean animals? If an animal is considered unclean, why would God even allow it on the ark? Not to say it's sinful or evil or bad, but if something is unclean, and why would he allow it on the ark? And when considering animals up to this point, there has been no explicit mention. In Genesis chapter 1 up to this point, there's been no clear statements, anything hinting at animals being clean or unclean yet. This seems to be a new idea being introduced now. So the question I have as a reader, 7 chapters into Genesis, why is this concept being introduced right here? Also in verse 3, it says, bring them in to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. That's an interesting reason to bring the animals or at least the 7 pairs of clean, 7 pairs of birds, and then the 1 pair of unclean, God's main concern seems to be about the offspring of these clean and unclean animals, rather than the parents who are brought on the ark. Obviously, you need parents to have children, but the parents are brought in order to preserve the future offspring. This is about preserving seed. This is about preserving generations and descendants. Also, God doesn't specify what birds to bring, so we go, why? Why just 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens? Are these 7 different birds picked at random? Does God just let Noah arbitrarily choose? Is this sort of like how God let Adam choose the names for the animals in Genesis chapter 2? Whatever the man chose, God approved of it. Or does this actually give us insight into how God partners with mankind? Hey, Noah, choose 7 pairs. Just 7 pairs, man. And God lets Noah decide what that looks like. Or are there details left out that we don't know? And the last question about verse 3, and then we'll pick it up in verse 4, the next video, is these animals being brought into the ark are described as being kept alive on the face of all the earth. Look at the language. Keep them alive on the face of all the earth. It doesn't say they're taken. It doesn't say they're removed from the earth, because this gets into rapture theology. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus will specifically reference, he'll talk about how it will be when he comes back. It will be like the days of Noah. One's taken, one's left. And essentially, well, depending on how you read it, he's talking, at least from their vantage point in the Gospels, a future day. And he says, one will be taken, one will be left, and then we insert rapture theology there. And all I'm saying is, the way that Jesus references the days of Noah, one's taken, one is left, we have to ask, who is taken in the Noah story, and who is left in the Noah story? And I think that will give us better understanding and a clearer picture of who Jesus means when he says one is left and one is taken. Are the righteous left? Are the righteous taken? Are the wicked left? Are the wicked taken? I'm just saying, in Noah's story, the offspring, the people, the animals rather, are kept alive on the face of the earth. They're not taken from the earth. They're not removed. They're left with Noah. And that's actually the language that we're going to see at the end of this chapter, that they're going to be left on the earth. Something to think about for those that have a certain rapture theology. I'm just saying, the way that Jesus references the Noah story and says it will be like the days of Noah, we first have to say, in what ways is it like the days of Noah? What connection is he making? And then in what way are these ideas related? Are these stories related? And if he's saying one's taken, one's left, we have to go, is that the righteous or the wicked? Let's look at who in the Noah story is left. Is it the wicked that are left? Or is it that Noah that's left? Is Noah taken technically and the wicked are left on the earth? What's happening? Because this does relate to how Jesus speaks of the end times and eschatology from his vantage point as a man on the earth. That's all I got for you guys. Let me know your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, disagreements. Be kind, and let me know all those things in the comments below. I love interaction, kind, respectful interaction. So I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Remember when God tells Noah to go into the ark because the flood is coming in 7 days? Why is there that 7-day waiting period? And what's the deal with Noah bringing 7 pairs of clean animals onto the ark? Also notice how Noah's ark seems to be an image of something we've already seen in Genesis 1 and 2. Because this is not the first time we've seen this idea. And there's a reason that we see this idea repeating here at the flood story. So let's dive into Genesis chapter 7, verse 4 through 9. Genesis 7:4 says, "For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights. I just want to highlight the 40-day, 40-night, 7-day, and every living thing I have made, I will blot out from the face of the ground. If I were to take 2 words and summarize this chapter of Genesis, I'd use the word taken and the word left. Taken and left, or destruction and preservation. To summarize this chapter, Noah finishes the ark. 7 days before the flood, God tells Noah to bring his family and the animals into the ark. God brings the flood waters onto the land to destroy all life, and the waters prevail for 150 days. Go watch the previous episode for key words, key ideas to look for, as well as brand new ideas that we're seeing in this chapter. I'm going to pick it up in verse 4. Back to verse 1 of chapter 7. The Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household. I've seen you righteous before me in this generation." Why did God tell Noah to go into the ark 7 days before the flood actually would happen? Why did God give him a 7-day heads up? Was that how much time was required to get everything ready and in order on the ark and to make preparation for just taking on the flood hitting the ark? Like, why the 7-day waiting period? And here's what I want us to think through. This number is incredibly important. It really is. The number 7 notes completion. The significance of the number 7 so far, let's just think so far in the story. 7 chapters into Genesis, what have we seen when it comes to the number 7? Well, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. So there's that 7-day creation period technically. In this story, God is waiting for these 6 days to bring destruction on the land and to bring about a kind of anti-creation, a decreation on the 7th day. So instead of God being done creating, let me say it differently. Instead of God finishing creation on the 7th day and resting, God begins the flood and the cleansing of the world on the 7th day to mark something new. Think about that contrast there. God himself links this moment back to the original creation story by saying this: in 7 days, I'm going to send rain on the earth, 40 days, 40 nights. So there's that day and night motif in the Genesis story, the emphasis on the land of the earth and the ground, but also the fact that God has made every living thing that he's about to blot out. There's just a few correlations to the original creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, but this right here seems like an unnecessary detail. So this is why I go here. When I read the story and I go, every living thing that I have made, he could have just said every living thing or all life, but God intentionally says every living thing I've made, noting his hand in creating those things, how those things originate in him. And we have to ask why. Why is God linking this moment here in the flood story back to the original creation story by letting us know, yes, I'm the one who brought about all life, because he's about to destroy all life now. And here's what I want to say about the number 7 before we jump into the following verses. This, I think, is foundational. The number 7 represents completion, and it's something that we've seen with creation as well as the holy Sabbath day God blesses as a day of rest. We've seen the number 7 as it relates to the sevenfold vengeance for Cain in Genesis 4. We've seen the 7 pairs of clean animals right here, 7 pairs of birds rather, as well as the 7 pairs of clean animals. So there has been you can even go a little further into the story in Genesis. You can look at Joseph's story, the Joseph story. Why can't I talk today? And Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh specifically dreams about 7 cows, 7 skinny cows, 7 fat cows. Then another dream, 7 full stalks of grain and 7 withering stalks of grain. Jacob serves Laban 7 years. And then we can go even further into the story. Joshua walks around the walls 7 days with 7 priests and 7 trumpets. And 7 times they walk around on the last day, the 7th day. There's many more examples, okay? So I just want to note that, yes, the number 7 does note completion and is significant throughout the biblical story. Something else important to note is the presence of the 7-day period. So for instance, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see the 7-day creation period, where on the 7th day God rests. Now here's what I want to really connect us to. In Exodus, I was reading this just this morning and it clicked for me. In Exodus 29, actually I'm going to hold that thought, pull it back in. In Exodus, God gives the people of Israel the 7-day period where they only eat unleavened bread starting on Passover from the 14th to the 21st day. In Exodus, we also see the 7-day ordination period for the high priest and his sons. So Aaron and his sons are ordained, they're commissioned, they're consecrated, and they're anointed. Okay, so there's a 7-day ordination period for the high priest and his sons to enter into service to God. And for 7 days, they're wearing the garments that have been fashioned skillfully. For 7 days, the altar is being consecrated and atoned for, while Aaron and his sons enjoy that 7-day period of sort of feasting with the Lord. There's an interesting connection to note between here and that Exodus story. In Exodus chapter 29, we see that ordination period for the high priest and his sons. And this 7-day high priest ordination period, I want us to think through this, it involves 3 specific things being consecrated. So during that 7-day period, while the high priest and his sons are kind of waiting to enter into service, there are 3 things being consecrated. There's going to be the altar. It's being made atonement for. The people, Aaron and his sons, so the altar and the people are being consecrated during that period. And then at the end of that, we're going to see the sacred space, the tabernacle, be consecrated, where the high priest and his sons will serve God. So those 3 things. And then right smack dab in the middle, we have a time of judgment upon the wicked, where the rebellious Israelites within the nation are actually judged and destroyed. The Levites come in, purge 3,000, the nation of 3,000 men after the whole golden calf debacle. Remember, they make a golden calf and they bow down. After that, the Levites come in, clean house, purge that nation of 3,000 men. And then after that, it actually says that God brings a plague upon the people. And the reason I'm making this connection is because here's why. The Levites are ordained for service through that act of faithfulness to God. And if that's not a strong enough case, I would like to liken that to a mini flood, where God removes the wicked from that space to continue with the people who are left over in that nation. So it's a kind of mini flood. But if that's not a strong enough case, in Exodus chapter 32, verse 35, to follow the golden calf story, God is going to send a plague on the people for their idolatry. Just like he sends a flood here, God sends a plague as a consequence and as punishment for their idolatry and rebellion. Just like we see God sending a flood here to remove the wicked in Genesis 7. So again, I'm just trying to keep this all succinct. In Exodus 29, the 7-day period was God consecrating the altar, the people for service, and the space itself. And then before the space is consecrated at the end of Exodus, the tabernacle, we see God bring the plague upon the wicked for their rebellious idolatry and evil. And we see those same components here too. Because the question becomes, why did God wait 7 days to bring the flood? Why that 7-day waiting period? And I see correlation between this 7-day waiting period and the 7-day consecration kind of anointing period for the high priest and his sons in Exodus 29. Okay, so we don't immediately, here's what I want to note. God takes a few people here in Genesis 9, attached to one man, that being Noah, and he puts them in a sort of floating safe place, a sanctuary of sorts, and then we see the flood come and take away the wicked. Okay, so we see the component of a sacred space, a set-apart people who will be brought through the judgment and through the waters of death into new life on the other side. We see God bring the flood upon the wicked, and we don't immediately see the altar yet being consecrated. So that aspect of, well, what about the altar? You said in Exodus 25 the altar's consecrated. Well, after the flood subsides and Noah comes out, Noah will offer sacrifices to God on the altar. And almost as if Noah has come through the flood and, been preserved by the grace of God to be consecrated for that priestly service unto God. The same way we see Aaron and his sons in Exodus 29. So the idea of God consecrating a sacred space here would be the ark, where a consecrated people, remnant, Noah and his family, are preserved to come out and offer sacrifices to God, that being Noah, almost as if playing this high priestly role. In other words, this 7-day period here in Genesis 7, while Noah and his family are waiting for the flood to come, the reason God warns them, and the reason we see this 7-day waiting period, is because this time period might involve a time of consecration, preparation, and we can even see the flood as a sort of cleansing and washing of the earth to make way for new life through Noah and his family. So I just want to put all that out there, all that information, and essentially say, go read Exodus 29 and Exodus 32 and then Exodus 40. Take all 3 of those chapters and then come back here to Genesis chapter 7 and see if you notice any correlation, because I sure did. I was wondering why the 7-day waiting period, and I know we haven't gotten to the text itself, but that's all just background. The statement God makes about removing, blotting out from the face of the ground all the life that he's made brings us back to when God made the ground creatures and placed them on the land in Genesis chapter 1. And through Adam's curse, we see the ground ends up being cursed, and man would return to the ground in death from which he came. So this idea of God taking life from the ground and, certain animals and Noah being left alive on the face of the earth, it brings us back to the original idea of the ground and the land, where God brought Adam up from the ground, and God brought the life of the land creatures from the ground. But now, this is not God bringing life from the ground here in Genesis 7. This is actually God taking life from the land and bringing it back into the ground from which it came. God made mankind and earth creatures from the dust of the ground, and now they're returning to it by God's decree, just like God said when Adam received the just penalty in Genesis 3 and the ground was cursed. Also, a question I have is, what was God doing for these 7 days of waiting? Hey, in 7 days, I'm going to send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. How come God didn't bring the flood down immediately after Noah? Presumably, some people might read this as Noah goes into the ark immediately, and then he kind of sits there for 7 days. I don't see that, and I'm not versed enough in Hebrew to actually note the verb tenses and such, but I will say, I see Noah going in on the 7th day with his family, and then God shuts them in, and the flood comes. So, if you read it differently, then I have a question for people who go, well, he went in immediately. How come God didn't bring the flood down immediately after Noah had gone into the ark? Why that kind of waiting? For God to blot out the creatures here that inhabited the land apparently required 40 days and 40 nights of rain. And we go, why 40 days and 40 nights? In the Bible, the number 40 notes a time of testing very often. For instance, Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days being tested. Israel's tested for 40 years in the wilderness. Goliath is taunting Israel for 40 days and mocking God. There's a sort of testing within that. Moses is on the mountain with God for 40 days, and Israel's put under a test. Will they be faithful? Will they not be? They didn't pass. Ezekiel lays on his side for 40 days as a sign of Judah's punishment. There's a 40-day time of mourning for Job. 40 days Israel is spying out the land of Canaan to see if it's going to be what they think, and then they bring back word. That's a time of testing. God told Nineveh through Jonah, 40 days and judgment's coming. That was a time for them to be tested, to be either faithful or not, to respond in faith or not. Jesus spent 40 days testifying and teaching after his resurrection, which seems to be a kind of testing for those who do not yet believe. But either way, the number 40 does carry that idea of testing. And this here, the 40 days and 40 nights, does note that here as well. The reference to the days and the nights, I see another correlation to the Genesis story of creation, where God, in the evening, in the morning, the first day, and then the evening, in the morning, the second day. You see that pattern. I see a correlation to that, a reference to the days of creation. But in this case, it's God destroying the old world to bring about a new one, rather than consecutively creating the world day after day until day 7. Also, if you go down to verse 5, we're finally moving on to verse 5. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. And this is not the first time we see this statement. Noah did all the Lord commanded him. We see that in chapter 6, verse 22 as well. So this is the second time. The idea of Noah building the ark. Just thinking about God, Noah has done all that God has commanded him. The idea of Noah finishing and building the ark is reminiscent of God creating the earth and finishing that in 6 days, then resting on the 7th. So I do see a correlation to that as well. God finishes creating in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rests. Well, Noah here has finished building the ark, and now there's that 7-day waiting period until the floodwaters come, and it's as if Noah entering in on the 7th day is a kind of rest, entering into the kind of rest that God provides found and contained in the ark. Just like God rests from his work on the 7th day, we see the presence of 7 days here as well. Then Noah will come out of the ark into a kind of new world, or a new creation, you might say, where God starts over with him and his family, just as God did with Adam and Eve. When God placed Adam and Eve in the garden, they enter into a state of rest, like they're created in a condition of rest, entering into God's rest. Also, the scripture does repeat exactly what we see in chapter 6, verse 22. Noah did all that God commanded him, but in that case, it was Noah building the ark. In this case, It's actually Noah entering into the ark and in obedience to God's word and taking with him. Now he's taken his family and the animals and the 7 pairs of clean and the 7 pairs of birds. And so far there are 2 stages to Noah's obedience. The first stage is Noah builds what God says to build. The second stage is Noah is finished the ark, and now he's going to bring the animals and his family into what has been completed. So we go, why does the text almost verbatim state what was noted in chapter 6? Why is there an emphasis on Noah did what God commanded? I think we're supposed to see just a faithful, obedient man. Not a perfect man, but a faithful, obedient one. Noah was 600 years old. It's an old fella. When the floodwaters came upon the earth, emphasis once again on the land or the ground, experiencing the floodwaters God brings. So a question I have is, why do I care how old Noah is when the floodwaters come, when we don't even know when he started building the ark or even when he finished? Just because God comes to him in the beginning of chapter 7 and says, hey, floodwaters are coming, that doesn't mean he just finished building the ark. There could have been a long gap. We don't know how long how much time has transpired since Noah finished the ark, and then God comes to him and goes, bro, in 7 days. We don't know how much time has passed. So I have a question. What is the connection between Noah's years here being 600 and the flood of destruction coming upon the land and the ground? Seeing how Noah's age is a multiple of 6, and we think of 6 as usually the number of man. Also in verse 6, God said he would send rain, yet in the next 2 verses, we see the rain referenced to as floodwaters, right here. The flood waters. The flood waters. But if you go to verse 4, God says, I will send rain on the earth. Not to say that God lied or there's disagreement in the text, but I'm just wondering why that change in how he refers to the waters that are coming. First it's rain, now it's floodwaters. The 2 references are the same, and they're 2 ways of referring to the same idea for sure. But why the 2 different ways of referring to what God is sending on the earth? What does it highlight about this story in this moment to say that the flood waters are coming? When God said, I'm sending rain, and Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Notice what they're doing. They're escaping. They're going into the ark. And look at who they're with. They're with Noah. And I think that's super important. They're not going on their own. They're attached to one who was deemed righteous in the sight of God. Noah and his family are described as escaping the flood by going into the ark. The ark here is viewed as a sort of safe haven or salvation from death and destruction. And God, this is what I really want to hammer down. God does not keep the flood far away from Noah and his family. God actually brings Noah and his family safely through the floodwaters. He doesn't bring them around the flood to completely avoid it. And this just screams the parting of the Red Sea story, where God doesn't bring the Israelites the route you think they would, that he would bring them. He brings them directly to the waters where he'd have to part them in order to bring them through to the other side. The idea here is they do escape the destruction of the flood. Why can't I talk today? They do escape the flood and the destruction, but not the presence of the flood. It still happens around them, but they go safely through it inside the ark. So this is a statement. The reason why I bring this up is because this is a statement about how God is not a refuge away from the storm and away from destruction. He's a refuge and a safe haven in the midst of it. God could have done this any other way and brought them super far, done something else, but he gave them a safe place in the middle of the flood, not far away from it. And so I just want to highlight the fact that God provides safety and salvation and peace and refuge right in the middle of chaos and death. And this is exactly what Jesus is to us. He is our eternal salvation, not later, but right now, presently in the midst of this broken world, and eventually when we go through death, he's our way through that to life on the other side. We don't avoid death, we go through it. We don't avoid trials and tribulations, we go through it. God doesn't bring us far away from it, he brings us through it, and he's our safe haven in the midst of it. This just speaks to how God doesn't always take his people far from issues and problems. but God does promise to be what we need in the midst of whatever he brings us through. In order to escape the flood, they had to listen to God's voice. Look at Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark. Well, what did God tell Noah to tell his family? Tell them to go into the ark with you. So they had a choice. Just as much as Noah did, just as much as everyone else on the planet did, they had a choice. Will we listen to what God has told Noah and obey, or will we not? But if they wanted to escape, they had to listen. It was not enough for Noah to build the ark and stand and go, whoa. They wouldn't be saved by standing back and admiring the hard work of their father and what he had built. Presumably, even if they had helped Noah build the ark, which the text never actually says, if they had helped their father build the ark, even so, they're not saved by standing back and priding themselves in what they had built with their own hands. They had to actually trust God and listen to his voice again. So one moment of obedience wasn't sufficient. Here's a new opportunity to actually obey and trust God's voice. And you can't rely on when you obeyed God in the past. Now is a new opportunity. Noah, here's what I want to say about this. Obedience doesn't just happen one time. Obedience is a continual lifestyle. Noah obeyed God each time God commanded him. And it might have felt and looked somewhat ridiculous to not only build the ark, but to potentially, depending on how you read the text, if he went in 7 days before it even started raining, that looks ridiculous. And the text doesn't say Noah was or wasn't mocked or persecuted or ridiculed by anyone, but there's a chance, there's a possibility. And obedience will often look ridiculous to people who don't believe or trust in God the way we do. Noah's family is only safe because they go into the ark with Noah. This is the key phrase. It just brings me back to Jesus. It's a statement about their relationship to Noah. It's a statement about their proximity to Noah, their attachment to Noah. And this is what happens when we believe in Jesus. Ephesians tells us we are spiritually positioned in Jesus through faith, so that we are safe through him and in him. He's our refuge and salvation. We're safe from death and destruction. And even if we go through it, he's our way to the other side. And we'll see the same idea throughout Scripture, where God will bless and protect those who are attached to the one that he has chosen. Whether it's Moses and the people of Israel crossing through the Red Sea, whether it's the people following Joshua into the promised land through the Jordan River, whether it's the household of Abraham and his offspring, being attached to Abraham, whether it's the nation of Israel and any Gentile converts who want to come into God's chosen nation. There's this theme of the ones God has chosen, or the one God has chosen, and then those who latch themselves on to and have relationship with that chosen one, they get to walk through and be safe with that chosen one. And that theme culminates in Jesus. We're going to end in verse 9. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded Noah. Look at the animals that are described. Clean, not clean. Those that creep, those that are birds. I have a question. We see the emphasis once again on creatures being what? With Noah. With Noah. Not just his family, but the animals too. The point is that Noah is the righteous one in God's sight. Not to make him perfect, not to make him some Christ, type. Well, he does foreshadow Jesus in some ways, but he's not a savior and a Messiah. But he does, in some ways, foreshadow Jesus. Noah is the righteous one in God's sight, and the blessing and favor on Noah for protection and salvation is extended to anyone or anything that would join him in the ark. So the question becomes for me as we close, why does the author of Genesis here refer to the animals as being clean, unclean, birds, and then things that creep on the ground? Genesis 1 and 2 seems to give us different categories to distinguish between creeping things, beasts of the earth, the land creatures, and yet here it seems to either just kind of capture all the land creatures in one category as those that creep on the ground. That's one thing. That's one possibility. Or the author is intentionally mentioning only the land creatures that creep on the ground with the birds and clean and unclean animals. Another option is that the clean/unclean animals is actually a statement about the beasts of the earth and the land creatures. But I just want to note that the author chooses here to refer to the animals in this way when they go with Noah into the ark. But the text has no problem telling us when we see beasts of the earth or cattle or ground creatures versus those ground creatures that creep on the earth. There is a distinction. And for some reason, they're either left out here intentionally or they're mentioned within one of these categories in passing and they're just summed up. I don't know what's going on there. But we'll see when we get to the rest of this chapter, the animals referred to a little differently. And that's when I'll kind of bring us back to verse 8. So hold on to that, put a pin in it. And in fact, if you want to do your homework, read up to verse 16. That's going to be your homework. If you really want to get ahead in preparation for the video, read up to verse 16 and see if you notice any other ways the animals are referred to or any other categories that are given for the animal kingdom. That's all I got for you guys today. This has been a longer video, so I apologize. Let me know in the comments your thoughts, questions, insights, revelations, connections, whatever it is. Be kind, be respectful. Be respectful. Don't make fun of the fact that I can't talk today for some reason. Pray for me. And I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Remember when God warns Noah of a coming flood? What's the deal with the great deep bursting open and the windows of heaven opening up? What's the significance of God sealing Noah and his family into the ark? And why does the flood story sound very similar to a parable Jesus gave centuries later? Let's dive into Genesis chapter 7, verse 9 through 16 and find out. We'll start in verse 8. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean and of birds, everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. A few things to note is this: the 7 days, the waters, and the earth. Okay, let's get started. 2 words to capture this entire chapter would be either preservation and destruction or taken and left. Taken and left. To summarize this chapter, Noah finishes the ark, and 7 days before the flood, God tells Noah to bring his family and the animals into the ark. God brings the flood waters onto the land to destroy all life, and the waters prevail for 150 days. You can watch the first episode in this Genesis 7 series for the key words, key ideas, and the chapter breakdown. For now, we're going to jump right in. Verse 9, this is the 3rd time that we see this statement. God commanding Noah, and then Noah doing everything that, don't know where that came from. Noah doing everything that God commanded. We've seen that right here in verse 5. Noah did all the Lord had commanded him. We've seen that at the end of chapter 6. Verse 22, Noah did all that God commanded. So this is the 3rd time. There's something about that statement that is incredibly important for what is going on. Noah built the ark the 1st time. He obeyed God. Noah went into the ark the 2nd time. Even down to the details of bringing in the right amount of each specific kind of animal, clean versus unclean birds, all that stuff. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. The flood waters came exactly when God said they would, which was after Noah had done all that God had told him to do. In other words, God accounted for when Noah would do. Noah listened, Noah obeyed, and then the flood waters come. Part of God's timing actually involved Noah's obedience. And I think that speaks to just something about God and how he works in the earth. Also, the fact that the floodwaters came right here after 7 days. Lost my place in my note. The fact the floodwaters came after 7 days doesn't mean that 7 days passed since Noah went into the ark. And again, I read this story as Noah went into the ark actually on the 7th day. And I get that from verse... Where is it? It'll say the exact day. And rain fell on the verse 13, right here. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, they go into the ark. Same day of what? Same day of the flood. So I am working from the idea. I know other people would read this as Noah went in 7 days before the flood when God told him to. God didn't tell him when to go in. He just said to go in. There was no time frame attached to that. So Noah obeys either way, whether it was the day of the flood or 7 days before. And I read it as, hey, 7 days before the flood, we have that waiting period. Noah goes in the day of the flood. And the fact that the floodwaters came after the 7 days doesn't mean that Noah has gone into the ark and 7 days have passed. Rather, the point of reference is not Noah going into the ark, but the point of reference is that God told Noah to go into the ark before the floodwaters came in 7 days. After 7 days, the floodwaters came upon the earth. Noah and his family could have gone into the ark anytime before the floodwaters came. And here's what I want to connect this to. Matthew chapter 7, Jesus gives one of the most famous parables, being the parable of the wise man building his house on the rock. We know the songs about it. And then the foolish man building his house on the sand. Here's what I want to say about that. Matthew 7 speaks of two men that build two houses on two foundations. Both houses go through a flood and experience the floodwaters, but only one stands because that person obeyed the words of Jesus. That person did what God said, which was to trust in Christ for salvation, and he built his life on the rock of Jesus. And that parable is almost a mirror image of what's happening in this story. Here's what I mean. Two groups of people here are doing something. You have Noah and his family going into the ark, and then everyone else is outside the ark in disobedience, rebellion, presumed wickedness, and just nothing but bloodshed and violence. So you have two groups, two categories of humanity right here in this story. Those who are in the ark and those who are not. Those who are swept away by the floodwaters and those who are not. And they stand strong and they're protected in the ark. One of these groups of people, that being Noah and his family, they build what God said to build and they listened to God's words. The others did not. God told Noah build the ark. He literally built this ark to find refuge in when the floodwaters came. He literally built something in response to God's command and in obedience. One builds on a strong foundation, Noah and his family, and the others do not, and they're swept away. Both experience the flood, but only one is safely brought through, standing on faith. It seems as though what Noah builds here, the floodwaters coming 7 days after God said they would, coming upon the earth. If you go back to Genesis chapter 6, you're going to see that what has essentially expanded across the land is nothing but bloodshed and violence, which seems to have originated in Cain, his line, and his city, which he names after Enoch, Cain's son, okay? So what you see is Cain built a city that was built on bloodshed and violence, and it was filled with wickedness and rebellion. And in contrast, here, Noah builds an ark, which is built in faith and obedience and trust. And it preserves life and it keeps life rather than taking life and bringing death. And I just see that strong contrast between not just the two men in Jesus' parable, but as Jesus' parable speaking to almost like these two categories of humanity. You have the wicked line of Cain building their own city on bloodshed and violence to bring death and destruction. And then you have Noah building an ark in faithfulness and obedience to God. And only one stands through the floodwaters. Verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, that is so many times longer than most of us will live, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day. What day? 600th year. Not specific enough. Okay, second month. Not specific enough. 17th day of the month. Not specific enough. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth. In other words, the floodwaters came. The windows of the heavens were open. What's the deal with these windows and then the great deep? What's interesting about these two statements, these ideas, is we see these statements about the great deep and the windows of heaven. We see these statements linking us back to Genesis chapter 1. So in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the deep, and then God places an expanse between the waters to separate the waters above from the waters below, that being the heavens. Now, instead of God creating and structuring and ordering the world, God actually allows creation to implode and descend into disorder and chaos. In other words, what you're seeing here is not creation and things being built up and ordered and structured. You're seeing anti-creation that results from sin and wickedness. It's as if in Genesis 1, God's hands are shaping the formless world like clay. And now, with the floodwaters coming from both the heavens and the great deep, now it's as if God has taken his hands off for good and favor, and he's sovereignly allowing the world to actually cave in on itself to start over. What God has held together and even held back seems to be what he releases now. He's releasing what was kept back by the windows, by the the heavens and that keeping the waters above from the waters below. He's releasing the waters from beneath, so that again the land seems to descend into a state of disorder and chaos, which is what we see as the starting point in Genesis chapter 1, and God works from there. And then another question I have is, why do we know down to the exact day, month, and year, why are we given the exact day when the flood came? And also, why is Noah's age the reference point for the flood? Why measure the time of the flood based off Noah's life and how old he is? Just something to think about. Also, why does reverse creation happen in the 600th year? 600 being a multiple of 6, the number of man. How does the number 6 connect this story? Or rather, how does the number 6 itself connect to disorder and destruction and death, specifically taking place in this 600th year of Noah's life? Also, this is the second time Noah's age is referenced alongside the floodwaters coming. So we see the first time in Genesis chapter 5, Noah's 500 when he has his kids. And then in Genesis 6, or rather, is it Genesis 6? Verse 6 of chapter 7, I wrote down. Right here. Same chapter. I misread my notes. Noah's 600 when the flood of the waters came upon the earth. And we have more detail here. Not just 600, second month, 17th day. This is the second time Noah's age is referenced in connection to the floodwaters coming. It's just something to note. Also, we're told that God was going to bring the rain and the floodwaters, right? But here in verse 11, the text says, the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heaven were opened. And there's no explicit statement about God, and I just want to think about this. God has said, I will bring rain, I will bring the floodwaters, God is going to do stuff. And then when it actually comes down to it, and it all goes down, it just says, the great deep burst forth. The windows of the heavens were opened. And what I'm trying to say about that is we can assume, we can for sure know that God is sovereignly over all things. Okay? But right here specifically, even though God said, I'll bring the floodwaters, I'll bring the rain, there's no explicit statement about God or anyone directly acting upon the great deep or the windows. There's no explicit statement about God directly doing something here. We can assume God is sovereignly over it and allowing this to happen to remain consistent with what he said, that he'd bring the floodwaters, but there might be a reason that it's stated in this kind of way. As if to say creation is kind of left on its own. God is over it. God said it would happen. He's in control. He's sovereign. But the way it's communicated, it's as if creation is just left to its own devices, and without the guiding, favorable hand of God on it, it just descends into nothing but disorder and chaos. So again, there's a reason I think the author states it this way, as if to say without God's hand of favor, creation just descends into nothingness. And then we go, okay, what can we conclude? Well, we can ask, how might this kind of understanding reveal what's happening deeper in the story? At least we can take away that God sovereignly acts as the creator and sustainer of all things, and if his hand of favor and grace is removed from anything, it can't flourish, and it will inevitably fall apart without his sovereign hand of approval over it. In other words, nothing can last or be sustained without God saying that it will. And then verse 12, the rain fell upon the earth 40 days, another reference to how long the rain is going to come upon the land. On the very same day. What day? What day are we talking about? Well, the only other day that's referenced is on that day. The flood happens. So on that day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and Noah's wife and 3 wives of his sons with them, what do? On that day that the floodwaters come, they enter the ark, which would be the 7th day. So this is why I'm convinced that Noah did not go into the ark 7 days prior to the flood coming, but on the actual day of the flood. And that 7-day period was a time of preparation, somewhat consecration as well. But I would say, even if we go back to verse 1 and we say, well, God told Noah to go into the ark, he didn't say or specify when. It seems like he's going in the day the flood starts, and all stuff breaks loose. Also, the names of Noah's sons here are stated: Shem, Ham, Japheth. Who cares? I care. Because we haven't seen their names since chapter 5, verse 32. His sons have been referenced several times, and the text has no problem saying their names. But every other time, since chapter 5, verse 32, his sons have not been clearly named and identified personally. So I wonder, why are their names mentioned here when elsewhere they're just Noah's sons? And we know who they are, we know their names because they're chapter 5, but why here are they specifically named? For me, that's an interesting detail and something to note. Noah and his, Noah and his sons' names are mentioned. I will go here, actually. But we're never actually given the name of Noah's wife. It just says, Noah's wife. The Bible is so anti-women. No. Don't go there. Don't be weird. Just because their names are left out doesn't mean they're less valuable. There's something about the story that is emphasizing Noah and his sons, and it's not like the women don't matter, but they kind of fade into the background when it comes to the main point of what is being stated in this chapter. So I go, why don't we see their names? Why is their identity mysterious? Why is their heritage mysterious? What does their lack of detail highlight about this story and what's happening in this moment? The fact that certain details are left out, their heritage, where they come from, what their names are, instead of running with that a weird direction, I can go, hey, what does that tell me about what I should be thinking about this story in this moment? Verse 14, not only did they go into the ark with Noah, but they and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind. So if you watch the second video in this Genesis 7 series, I said, hey, in verse 8, the animals that go in with Noah are the creeping things. Well, I'll just take you to verse 8. With my weird stain, clean animals, birds, not clean animals, and then everything that creeps on the ground. That's what goes into the ark with Noah. Okay? So, right here, we have some different categories. I just want you to note that. I'm not saying anything about it. I'm just saying for some reason we have more detail or different categories being worked with here. We have the livestock and creeping things. So we can't say, well, creeping thing captures all land creatures. No, because we have livestock. We have birds. We even have winged creatures. And then in verse 14, right before we get to this part, we have the beasts. So guess what? We have the beasts. We have the livestock. We have the creeping things. We have the birds. We have the winged creatures. Why didn't verse 8 work with those same categories? We were already told in verse 8 and 9 the animals went into the ark, and now for some reason that same detail is repeated here. That they all go into the ark with Noah. It's like, well, we already know that, so can we move on? Apparently, that detail is very important, that they go with Noah. And we already know that happened. Why repeat it again? What's being emphasized here is my question. And also, are winged creatures variations of birds? Are they kinds of bugs? What are these winged creatures? You might get an answer by reading the rest of the Bible. Off the top of my head, I ain't got nothing. But we see the distinction once again between creeping things, livestock, and beasts. And all I'm saying is, in verse 8, they're just referred to as clean, unclean animals, and then birds and creeping things. And I just go, why? Why? They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. I would like to know why this is mentioned. Obviously, if they're living creatures, they have the breath of life. So if this seems like an unnecessary detail, that it's like, well, that's assumed, we should lean into that and go, well, why is that being stated here clearly? The brief mention of these creatures having the breath of life is significant to me. We haven't seen this mentioned since chapter 6, verse 17. So go back a chapter, read verse 17. That's the last time we see God talking about the creatures that have the breath of life. And in that chapter, it's talking about God removing creatures that have the breath of life on the earth. Now let me just verify that I ain't off the walls crazy. Just scanning. Scan. Everything. Okay, cool. I am correct. The last time we see the breath of life mentioned is in chapter 6, verse 17. And there, it's God talking about removing the breath of life, creatures on the land. And here, it's actually talking about those that are preserved. And the only other reference to the breath of life, can you guess where we see that? I'll give you 5 seconds. Chapter 2 of Genesis, when God breathes the breath of life into man's nostrils, and in chapter 1, where the animals have the breath of life from God. So this statement not only mentions the severity of what's taking place, like God really removed life from the land, but it's actually linking us back to the original creation story to say that things are no longer good the way they were intended to be. The condition of the world and life, it's not good as it is. And God needs to bring creation back to the ideal, even if it's not exactly in the Garden of Eden and good like that, like the good old days. There needs to be a kind of a reset back to the original intent and the purpose of creation. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, which was, did we see that already? Yeah, all flesh right here. I'm just going to highlight that because I didn't notice that twice. The emphasis of it being all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. So let's end here. This is the 4th time we see the idea of Noah doing all that God commanded him. Now this, it doesn't exactly say Noah did all that God commanded him, but the fact that he brings the animals, the male and female in the flesh, it's in obedience to God's command. This is the 4th time we see that idea. And each time Noah obeys God's command, we see God respond to Noah's obedience by doing what Noah could not do. So it's as if Noah does what he can and God will do what he cannot. And in chapter 6, verse 22, go read it, Noah built the ark. God responds by telling Noah in chapter 7 when the flood is coming and what to do next. And then when Noah took the 7 pairs of clean animals with the 7 pairs of birds and went into the ark, we see God bring the floodwaters that day. And then here we see God shut Noah in and his family into the ark. So there's this partnership. There's this God responds, God waits, God is patient, God lets humanity respond in obedience and faithfulness. Then God does his part. There's a co-laboring going on that God does not have to involve humanity in, but it's beautiful. Also, what does it mean for God to shut Noah in? That's some aggressive language. Did God close the door because it was too heavy? It was too large? Did God lock it up tight and kind of seal them in? Was there an extra level of security because God's hand was on it? It does bring me to the idea of us in John chapter 6. Jesus talks about how we are secure in his hands. No one can remove us from his Father's hands. His Father is stronger than anyone. No one can get out of his hands. No one can take us from his hands. It's that, hey, he's got you. It's a good thing to be got by God and safe and secure. So my question is, was this just a statement about God ensuring Noah's safety with his family and the animals? Because it's interesting to note that Noah is never actually said to be closing the door behind him. Now you can assume he did. You can assume, well, he needed help. It was too big. But we only see Noah going into the ark. That's it. And then God shuts him in, which could be God shutting the door in, which actually, for me, sounds similar to Jesus being placed in the tomb and sealed up with the stone. But instead of God speaking, instead of God sparing his son from experiencing death, God actually allows his son to be temporarily shut up behind the tomb in the grave, only to break out in victory and, of course, roll away the stone. And I think the same way we'll see Noah come out of the ark with his family into a kind of new life, which the resurrection points to, or rather that moment in Noah's story points to the resurrection. But in this case, Noah is shutting Noah in to spare him from death, whereas God actually purposely allowed his son to be shut up into the grave in the tomb so that he could resurrect and break forth from that. In other words, one is sparing from death, the other is bringing life through allowing his chosen one to go into death, that being Jesus. So I just see the idea of Jesus being shut in the tomb. Maybe that's a weird correlation, but for me, that's just where I go. because there's so much of this story that screams salvation and redemption in Christ through faith. And so it would make sense that the way that God shuts him in is this extra level of security and safety, but also the way that Jesus was sealed up was supposed to keep his followers from breaking him out. And it's as if God does the opposite. He allows him to be shut in, but he intends to break him out. Whereas here, he shuts Noah in to spare him from death. Maybe a weird correlation. That's just where my mind goes. And then here's the last thing I want to say. And there are probably other stories, like Daniel being sealed up in the tomb, the lion's den, Joseph being put in the prison or in the pit. He's sort of sealed up in both. But God's hand is over all of those scenarios to bring life through that. Last thing to say. 3 times we're told Noah and his family with the animals went into the ark. Noah, his family, with the animals went into the ark. Verse 7, verse 13, and now here in verse 15 and 16. Then in verse 11 and 15, the animals went into the ark. And there are many references to God's remnant going into the ark, instead of it just being a one-time event to move on from. It's constantly being brought up. I want you to note that in verse 7, 13, here, 11, 15, there's this repeating idea of going into the ark. It's not just like, when it happens, we'll talk about it, and then we'll never talk about it again. There's so many times throughout this chapter, the idea of going into the ark is mentioned. And I think there's significance within that for this story. At least that is a main component to what's going on. Noah, animals, family going into the ark. And though it does happen one time, it's stated many times. And I think as good Bible students, we're to pay attention to how frequently that repeats and then go, what am I supposed to know about that as it relates to this story? What am I supposed to conclude? What is it that God is showing us through that? We will pick it up in verse 17 in the next Bible study walkthrough. Until then, let me know your thoughts, questions, comments, everything, whatever, as long as you're respectful and kind. Share that in the comments below. I love hearing what God is teaching you and what you take away from these, to know that they're actually helping, teaching you how to read the Bible with a different, different perspective and in a different way than maybe you're used to. But that's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Do you remember when God brings a flood upon the wicked people of the land? You ever noticed how the ark is floating over the waters, the same way the Spirit of God is in Genesis chapter 1? And consider how the ark is said to be above the mountains and why that might be significant. And why does the author talk about the floodwaters prevailing as if they're conquering something? These details make all the difference in this story once you see them. So let's dive deep into Genesis chapter 7, verse 17 through 19. Genesis 7:17 says, "The flood continued 40 days on the earth." And we want to pay attention to this emphasis on the 40 days, being specifically about the flood on the earth. All right, let's get started. If I were to summarize this chapter in 2 words, I would use either destruction and preservation to capture what's happening, or I would use the 2 words being taken and left, taken and left. This chapter, just to summarize, Noah finishes the ark, and 7 days before the flood happens, God actually tells Noah to bring his family and the animals into the ark. God brings the floodwaters onto the land to destroy all life, and the waters prevail for 150 days. I'm just going to make some observations that I hope will be helpful. Hope will be helpful, if I can talk, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll see things you didn't previously. Talking about the flood continuing for 40 days on the earth, the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. I'm just going to highlight in green anything about the flood. The waters, they're increasing. They bear up the ark. And then anything, I can talk, the ark in yellow. The ark rises high above the earth, and it's borne up by is that the correct verb? It's borne up. Either way, the waters rising above the land is a reverse image. If we think of how God brought the land out of the waters in Genesis chapter 1, this is a reverse image of that. The waters are rising above the land instead of the land coming up out of the waters. And I think it's supposed to give us an image of a sort of decreation and anti-creation, destruction and life being removed from the land, rather than creation, God giving life and structuring and ordering. This is creation kind of imploding in on itself. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. So again, talking about the waters, I'm going to highlight anything about the waters in green. The waters are prevailing. Once again, they're increasing greatly on the earth. And the ark here is said to be what? Floating on the face of, highlighted in green, the waters. So green, I should have picked different colors, but I want us to think about this phrase right here, the waters prevailing and increasing greatly. We can say for sure that the waters prevailing is connected to and at least involves an increasing greatness, a greatness of increasing. The waters prevailing almost gives us a picture of water victoriously conquering and succeeding in some endeavor or achievement. The word actually means to increase or be strong, which assumes something to increase or be strong against or in comparison to. But the question becomes, what are the waters prevailing against? Because it says they prevailed right here above the earth. The ark is borne up, the waters continue on the earth, and they increase greatly on the earth. So I think we know what it is that they're prevailing against, that being the land. Where the land once came up out of the waters to rise above them. In Genesis 1, God calls the land out of the waters. Let's keep that in mind. Now we have the waters coming back onto the land to cover the ground. But even more specifically, I think what we see here in reference is the actual people on the land, more than just the land itself. The waters are coming back onto the land to cover the ground, but specifically it's the people on the land being covered. And it says the waters increased greatly right here, which actually is what humanity had done if you go back to Genesis chapter 6. Following the Cain murdering Abel and him having descendants and how humanity multiplies, Genesis 6 opens with humanity multiplying and increasing greatly because God told humanity and commissioned humanity to be fruitful, multiply, and increase on the earth. So they're doing that, except it's wickedness and sin that's prevailing over people through death and bloodshed. Cain allowed sin to overtake him. If you go to Genesis chapter 4, God talks about how sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, wants to consume you. Cain allowed sin to overtake him, and by giving into sin exponentially now, mankind is now giving into sin that overtakes them, and humanity is given over to the natural consequences of their wickedness, which is, what are the natural consequences of giving oneself over to sin continually over and over, generation after generation? Well, the consequence is that they're overtaken by the waters of death and destruction. And here we see the waters prevailing over mankind. Key word, prevailing over mankind, rather than mankind standing on the land that existed above the waters. And I'll come back to that in a minute, the whole idea of it prevailing. So we'll put a pin there. But notice this language right here. The ark here is floating on the face of the waters. Now, if you recall in Genesis chapter 1, that's essentially how the creation story opens. The only other time we see that phrase so far in Genesis is in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 1, where the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters and darkness is over the face of the deep. And so where God's Spirit was once over the waters in creation for structuring and ordering the world out of chaos, here we see a sacred space, that being the ark. That sacred space God has ordained is now filled with a few humans that are spared from the chaos waters that are coming back onto the land. And God is in the midst of them. God is in the midst of Noah and his family and the animals on the ark. That's a sacred, safe space where God's hand is over them for protection. So instead of the Spirit of God hovering sovereignly to bring order out of chaos, it's actually the ark here floating on the chaos waters that actually remove life from the land. But this ark here has God's favor and protection. Almost to say, and I want us to think through this together, almost to say that the ark is a symbol of God's Spirit hovering over the waters, but this time God has tucked a few humans away to be with him over the waters. And through these chaotic waters of death and destruction, God is actually bringing about a kind of new world that Noah and his family will enter into. We'll move on to verse 19 and hopefully come back to verse 18 in a little bit. And the waters prevailed. If you see a repeating idea of the waters prevailing, you are tracking with this whole thing. In fact, I'm going to highlight the earth in this color that I don't know the name of. Here we have the earth emphasized once again, and even right here. So how many times is the earth, the land, the ground going to be referenced? The waters prevailed so mightily or greatly on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And this we'll end at verse 20 today. The waters here prevailing, twice increasing greatly, bearing up the ark, rising above the mountains, so much so that all the high mountains under the heavens are covered. That idea, or I'll back it up. I don't believe the mountains are mentioned merely here in passing, just to reference, how high the waters were. That's a part of it, and that's to say, like, wow, that's a great amount of water. But here's what I'll say. We've already concluded in the previous videos, go watch those, we've concluded that the ark seems to be an image of the Garden of Eden, based on the descriptions and the language used of the ark. And this verse might reinforce that idea if you actually look at it. Verse 18 and 19 together, these two verses might actually reinforce that idea. The Garden of Eden, if you go back to Genesis 1, it's portrayed, and throughout Scripture, the Garden of Eden will be referenced as a high sacred place where God dwells with humanity, almost like a mountain. The way Jerusalem is described, not as a physical, literal mountain, but a spiritual mountain where God dwells with his people. And if you go throughout Scripture, that idea of a sacred high place mountain where God dwells with people, we see other examples of that theme in Scripture, that idea where God actually dwells, for instance, Mount Sinai, or the Mountain of Transfiguration. Jesus brings 3 of his boys up there. The Mount of Olives, where Jesus does some cool stuff there. Mount Moriah, God calls Abraham, sacrifice Isaac, God meets him there. Or how mankind will eventually try to build a high place to get to God. All throughout human history, the nations do this in their own pagan ways with their false gods, or the Tower of Babel is an image of that. There is an understanding that I think we just lack. There's an understanding that the high places and mountains, that's where God or mankind meets with the divine or the gods of that culture or that nation or what have you. So the ark here, floating on the face of the waters, here's what I want to say about it. It's above the mountains, it's above the land, it's on the waters that are above both, which makes the ark a kind of floating sacred space, which is compared to a mountain, a sacred space, a sacred mountain, which is why it's like a mini Eden on the waters. The ark is like a high mountain where God is meeting with just a few chosen remnant, Noah being the main one that God works with, and those who are attached to him. And then verse 19, in fact, I'm going to highlight for you any reference to the mountains. I think that's the only one that I see. Until we get to verse 20, again, the mountains will be referenced. Let's read verse 20. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. So what is the water doing? Covering the mountains. What is the water doing? Prevailing above. So the mountains here are what the waters are prevailing against, not just the land, not just the people on the land, but specifically the mountains. Almost, if we can say it like this, and I've never thought of it this way, but what humanity in their wickedness and rebellion were building, their own, empire, their own, trying to build their own space without God, that mountain that represents humanity's rebellion and religion and spirituality and wickedness and sin and death and destruction and bloodshed, the mountain that represents that is being overtaken by the waters that God brings. And I'm thinking through this real time, almost as if throughout Scripture there will essentially be, at times, competing mountains. The mountain of humanity and self-righteousness and effort and labor and, innovation, and not that innovation isn't good, but, paired with violence and bloodshed and rebellion and sin. That mountain that represents humanity without God is going to be contrasted with, the mountain of God, the way God wants us to do things, being in relationship with God. So I see here not just, hey, the ark is going higher than the mountains, and I think some of you might say, he's making something out of nothing. Go read Scripture, read the Bible, and look for any contrast between two different mountains. Because what I see here is not just the mini Eden rising above the mountains, almost to be like, hey, look, this is where God has his favor on humanity, and they're going to come out, and it's going to be a new world. But also, there's two competing mountains. There's the high place that God is actually a part of, that being the ark, where Noah and his family and the animals are, that sacred space, which is conquering the mountains, which seem to symbolically represent humanity in rebellion to God, which is them being washed away. Maybe I'm stretching it a little bit, but that just came to mind for me, and I'm going to go with it. When verse 19 mentions all the high mountains, and then verse 20, we often, I just want to think through this and be honest about any presuppositions we bring to the text, we often assume this means the highest mountains on the planet. at that time, whatever they may have been, if the landscape was in fact altered by the floodwaters. But the question is, when the author references the high mountains, all the high mountains were prevailed above the mountains. The question is, does this refer to every mountain on the planet? Or, think with me a little bit and entertain another perspective. I'm not going to tell you which one I hold to. I'm just saying, hey, there's other options. Or does the author have in mind specific high mountains? Because it's interesting that it doesn't say the floodwaters covered the highest mountain on the planet. There's no clear language like that, which you go, well, it seems pretty and all-inclusive and universal. It seems to be addressing every possible high mountain on the planet. You can go with that, but I'm saying there might be another reasonable, logical, and, sound perspective that we might be able to entertain, that being that it's interesting it doesn't say it covered the highest mountains on the planet. Instead, all high mountains, all the high mountains above the mountains, as if possibly the way I might be reading that is as if there's a specific region in mind or a specific set of mountains that the reader would have been aware of and understood that the author was referencing. Don't throw stones at me. I'm not going to tell you where I land. I'm just saying, let's examine any presuppositions we might be unknowingly bringing to the text. We'll end it here because I feel like I blabbered on for a while. 3 times in 2 verses, the emphasis is on the water prevailing. The waters prevailed, increased greatly. The waters prevailed, the waters prevailed. 3 times. The word means, again, to increase or be strong, which assumes something to increase or be strong against. And I said I'd come back to this. The fact that the waters in verse 17 and 18 are increasing greatly or mightily prevailing on the earth and covering the mountains underneath the sky or the heavens shows that the waters are almost to be viewed as an unstoppable force. No human, at least, no creature with the life breath of God on the planet, or on the land, rather, can actually tame or stop these prevailing waters. The waters are only increasing. And the only one who can stop these floodwaters and say enough is the God who actually structured the world and brought land out of the waters in the first place in Genesis 1. And God has sovereignly not just ruled over the mountains or the waters, but also he's decided they can only increase for 40 days. Right here, the flood continued for 40 days on the land. Why? Because God said so. God's still speaking, sovereignly ruling, and overseeing what's happening on the land in that moment. And so God will allow the waters to prevail until he steps in to mark out their boundaries once again, like we see in Genesis 1, and put them in their rightful place, just like in the creation story where God puts the boundaries around the waters they can't cross. And I think the reason I end here is because this shows the nature of our God, who might allow something to prevail for a time. But eventually God says enough, and he brings his chosen righteous remnant to stand on the top of whatever was prevailing for a season. And that's a theme throughout Scripture. This pattern is seen all throughout the biblical story, whether it's with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, even the nation of Israel. And then ultimately it culminates, I believe, in Jesus being put on a cross at the hands of the Romans, laying his life down, not choosing to summon legions of angels, but willingly yielding himself to the will of the Father, and eventually going into the grave to experience death for a time, and going into the chaos waters, metaphorically, for a time. And then eventually God says enough, and he pulls his son up from the grave into resurrection. And there will eventually be a time where God will say enough, no more death, no more sin, none of that has any presence on the earth anymore when God brings about new creation, where his people are brought through death to reign with Jesus and stand on top of death and darkness and the evil powers of sin and rebellion, all of that once and for all, when God conquers everything that we once could never do on our own. And it's the story of God letting the serpent, if you go back to Genesis 3, this is just what we see on repeat throughout the biblical story. It's the story of how God lets the serpent bite the heels of his son Jesus, only for Jesus to crush the head of the serpent through that bite. And so what God allows to prevail for a time, God will bring, there's so many stories of that. And of course, this might be a little different than those moments, but the idea and the wisdom within this still rings true, which is that God is over all that seems to be prevailing and conquering and unstoppable for a time or season. God is over that. And he's marked out the boundaries. He's decided there's an expiration date on everything that is currently prevailing in our world as it is until God says enough. And I think there's a lot of hope instilled in this, is that God allowed the floodwaters to prevail for 40 days. They last for 150 days on the land. And then God says, all right, time to bring about a new world with my chosen remnant. Now let's start this thing over. We will officially end this mini-series on Genesis chapter 7 in the next video session. So let me know your thoughts, questions, insights, revelations, even pushbacks in the comments. Be kind, be loving and respectful, and I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Remember when Jesus says one will be taken and one will be left? And usually believers call that the rapture. See, Jesus likens that day to the flood of Noah's day, when God destroyed the wicked people on the land. So we have to ask, what connection is Jesus specifically making? And I think in order to answer that, we need to be asking, why does Genesis 7 end with the waters prevailing for 150 days? Let's jump into Genesis chapter 7, verse 20 through 24 to find out. Genesis 7, verse 20, the waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. That word right there brings me all the way back to Genesis 1, when the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters and darkness is over the deep. But we're not going to go there yet. To summarize this chapter, Noah finishes the ark 7 days before the flood. God warns Noah, time to get in the ark, buddy. Bring your family, bring the animals. And God brings the floodwaters on the land to destroy all life. And I don't say that casually. That's just how to summarize this chapter. And the waters prevail for 150 days specifically. I think that's important. If I were to use two words to summarize what's happening in this chapter, I would either use taken and left, or I'd use destruction and preservation. Destruction and preservation. If you were to separate this chapter, and the reason I'm going to recap is because this is the last session here in Genesis 7. If you were to separate this chapter into just 3 general sections, verse 1 through 5, God instructs Noah what to do next now that he's built the ark. Correct verb tense. In verse 6 through 15, the second phase of Genesis 7 is Noah and those with him go into the ark and the floodwaters come. Verse 17 through 24 is describing the floodwaters and how they destroyed all life on the land. Some keywords to look for as you go back through these sessions. If you have not watched the other sessions, you can go watch those. You don't have to. But keywords to look for when you read Genesis 7, animals, ark, command, earth, or land, or ground, depending on translation. 7, the number 7, rain waters, or rain waters, birds, beasts, livestock, entering, going into, and prevail or prevailing. Those are keywords to look for, very important. Some key ideas are Noah's obedience, God's commandments, and you can take notes, you're allowed to. Floodwaters being released, entering the ark, Noah taking with him, or something being with Noah. The prevailing waters, and then 40 days and 40 nights. And then when we enter into this chapter, from chapter 6, there's some brand new ideas we have not seen in the first 6 chapters of Genesis. The concept of 40 days and 40 nights in particular, clean and unclean animals, and then God shutting something or someone in. Some ideas that we see in chapter 7, and then we'll finish this chapter, I promise, but this is all recap as we finish this session. Some ideas we have seen in the first 6 chapters of Genesis that we're seeing here in chapter 7 are the waters covering the land, the ground, and the mountains, one human being set apart, God sovereignly ruling over the waters, God preserving and protecting life, the 7th day being significant, or that time period of 7 days, God giving commands, we've seen that, mankind, animals, birds, and creeping things together, the breath of life being in the nostrils, and then entering into sacred space that God has marked with his favor and approval and protection. And then the last thing is God explicitly said to be making a covenant with man. Okay? So that will be how we start verse 20. The waters prevailing above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. For some reason, we get some repeating details about the floodwaters and how things are looking. If you were to go outside of Noah's ark and just look around, that's what's being described here. For some reason, you're going to see some of the same descriptions used quite a few times. So why are we told the specific measurement of how much higher the waters were than the mountains? Why 15 cubits? Why does this even matter? That's an interesting detail to me. If you just told me the mountains were covered, sweet. But the fact that the author takes time to tell you how much higher the waters were than the mountains tells me, ooh, pay attention to that. And I don't exactly know why, I can't put my finger on it. And all flesh died that moved on earth. And he's going to describe what all flesh is. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures, and then all of mankind. The end of verse 21. All flesh on the land ends up dying from the floodwaters, just like God told Noah, just like God said in chapter 6. But notice there's no mention of water creatures, of course. I think we know why, but just notice that they're not mentioned. Nothing about sea creatures, the great creatures of the deep, none of those are mentioned. Also, all flesh on the earth, land, in particular, ends up dying from the floodwaters. And I go, why is mankind last on this list? Right? Here it says, livestock, beasts, swarming creatures, and mankind. And my initial suspicion is, well, that seems to be the order of creation. If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, mankind's made last as the pinnacle of God's creation to rule and have dominion and govern and multiply and be fruitful, all that stuff. Okay, so maybe that's why, but I just wonder, why is mankind listed last? Listed last. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. It seems to reflect, again, the order in Genesis 1. God has mentioned that he will remove everything that has the breath of life from the land. If you go back, all flesh died that moved, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life. Okay. God has mentioned already this breath of life and how he's going to remove the creatures with the breath of life. In another place, he actually refers to all the flesh on the land. Instead of saying, all the creatures that have the breath of life, God refers to them as all the creatures he's made. But here in verse 22, I just want us to pay attention to that. The creatures are not mentioned in either of those ways. God has mentioned he'll remove everything with the breath of life from the land. In another place, he refers to all the flesh that he's made. But in verse 21, he says, all flesh died that moved on the earth. Now, verse 22 says the breath of life, and I'll get to that in a second. Kind of got ahead of myself. But I'm referring to this. When God refers to what is dying on the land, all the flesh that moved on the earth. Not all the flesh that had the breath of life, not all the flesh God has made, but this is a different way to refer to the creatures that have the breath of life. And my question is, why here are they referred to differently? Instead of what God has already referred to the creatures as. What might this highlight? The fact maybe they aren't moving anymore, whereas once they had the animating life force of God in them to move and breathe and have their being, now that's been taken from them. If so, if that's a possible thought that we can entertain, what are some key differences between the creatures that are still moving that God preserved on the ark and even in the waters and Noah and his family? What are the key differences between the moving creatures and those that are no longer moving because they have died? The idea of man being removed. Here, all flesh died, everything in whose nostrils was the breath of life. Mankind here is indeed removed. And it links us back to the last 3 verses mentioning how the waters prevailed. The waters prevailed. So if you go back verse 18, 19, and 20, I believe, 3 times the waters prevailing are mentioned specifically. And here's why I make this connection, okay? So let me just go back there for you. The floodwaters, they do what? They prevail in verse 18. The floodwaters do what? They prevail in verse 19. In verse 20, the floodwaters do what? They prevail. Okay, and I think I mentioned in the last video that there is significance to that idea of the waters prevailing against, almost conquering something. And here's what I want to link this to when it comes to humanity being removed from the land. We have seen, up to this point, especially in the last 2 chapters of Genesis, 4, 5, and 6, 3 chapters, we have seen humanity prevailing over one another, and the first being Cain. Humanity's prevailing, continuing into further depravity and wickedness with each generation. Since Cain murdered Abel in chapter 4, we have been given a picture of mankind that seem to think They're unstoppable. They can do anything without any consequences. They're just murdering and oppressing and advancing in their own evil kind of way through multiplication and innovation. But now, wicked, rebellious humanity has come face to face with something that it cannot actually stop, which is death itself, symbolized in the floodwaters. So humanity up to this point, or at least now, humanity's being put in their place. After prevailing for so long, God steps in, and he does what he said. He said in the beginning of chapter 6 that his spirit would not strive with, contend with, or abide in man forever. And now we see that God is prevailing righteously over wicked mankind through these floodwaters. And all the rebellion and bloodshed and violence and death and destruction humanity's brought, God is prevailing over that through these prevailing floodwaters. So this is not just floodwaters disconnected from God. This is God sovereignly putting humanity and creation into its place, bringing things back into a kind of order. This seems reminiscent of the Jacob story. When Jacob wrestles with God, he strives with God, and he prevails for a time. Verse 22 says, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. So we've seen the breath of life being in the nostrils already referenced. And if you go back to verse 21, it says that all the creatures that moved on the earth. So this is just another way of referencing the life on the earth, but in a different way. All the flesh on the land is referred to as having the breath of life, which if you go back to Genesis 6:17, that's how God referred to the creatures whose nostrils have the breath of life. So think of the key ideas in this verse and how they might actually relate to each other. Key ideas being this. I think I put down the dry land, death, and I put breath of life. So number 1, dry land. Number 2, breath of life. Number 3, dying or death. And in what ways do these ideas link us back to possibly the first 6 chapters of Genesis? Okay, essentially, what you're going to see is some cool connections. But I'll say this, the breath of life statement brings us back to Genesis 1 and 2 when God breathes the breath of life into mankind, into the land creatures that fill the land. And then when we get to verse 23, God is blotting out every living thing. Another way of referencing, there's just so many, not gonna mention that actually. He blots out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, creeping things, birds of the heavens. So what's being blotted out? Man, animals, creeping things, birds of the heavens. Okay. Essentially, verse 23 is repeating the same statement we saw in verse 21 and 22. If you notice it, I'll show you real quick. This is how I study my Bible. I go, what the heck, 3 verses? It took 3 verses to tell me that 3 times? Why? All flesh died. Okay. Verse 22, if I can get my Bible right, everything died. Verse 23, he blotted out every living thing. 3, you think we'd get it the first time. So when something like this repeats over and over, I'm going to pay attention to it. All living creatures are dying on the dry land, being removed, being blotted out. Why repeat this a 3rd time? And why state it differently here? This time God seems to be the active agent, right, in actually doing the blotting out and removing the life from the land. We've seen humanity prevailing and increasing. Now the waters are prevailing and increasing. And it's as if the author wants to make a statement that God is sovereignly over all of it. Whether humanity's prevailing in wickedness or rightful judgment and justice comes and that's prevailing over them, God is over all of it in every season of human history and forevermore. God is sovereignly over all things, working together, everything for good. And we love that, but sometimes there are seasons of things, people, entities prevailing that we'd rather just God kind of brush to the side and conquer already, but he allows it for a reason. We've seen statement after statement about the land and the ground being the object of the floodwaters, yet the author again repeats the idea here that they were removed from the face of the ground. Everything on the dry land, from the earth, depending on your translation, as if we didn't previously already know that. So again, pay attention to the repeating ideas, not just that creatures are being blotted out or removed or dying, but they're specifically being removed from something, from the land. In fact, here's where I want to kind of land this plane. Jesus himself, in Matthew chapter 24, and I believe in Luke 21 or Luke 17, Jesus will reference the days of Noah when he speaks of eschatology and future events, such as the destruction of the temple and his second coming. And Jesus will say, there will be a day when one is taken and one is left. And usually people assume this is the rapture. And they say, here's why. Noah was taken. The righteous was taken from the wicked earth, and the wicked were left to be destroyed. But what I want to show you here is a little something different than maybe what you have been taught and what I've been taught historically. These creatures, wicked humanity in particular, is what's in mind, they were blotted out. What does that mean? They were blotted out from the earth, which is a removal, an erasing of sorts. But Noah is left. Noah's left, and those with him in the ark. Now I just want to pause and say this verse says the wicked are blotted out or removed from the land, while Noah is left. So the righteous, per the text, the righteous is not taken, as much as we want to use that to reinforce our rapture theology. The righteous is not taken. The righteous here explicitly is left. That's the language. Whereas the wicked are explicitly, very clearly blotted out or removed or taken from the earth. So if Jesus is saying, in Matthew 24, if Jesus is saying one is taken, one is left, and then he goes, it's just like the days of Noah, then we should probably figure out, well, who's being taken and left in the flood story? And then I can make the proper connection to Matthew 24 and likely come to better conclusions. Also, this is not the only time we see something blotted out, right here. He blotted out everything with the breath of life. There were many times in Scripture we'll see the Amalekites blotted out, or the Canaanites blotted out, or people will be blotted out of Israel and of God's book. We'll see God blot out sins and transgressions and so on. There's lots of examples of that. And once again, the emphasis is on the animals and the people who are with Noah. So if you want to be left on the land when the dust has settled and the destruction is over and the wicked are taken, if you want to be left, in this story, it's about being with this righteous chosen vessel God has decided to use and work with and preserve. In other words, Noah here has a sort of priestly role. He's a sort of priestly figure. As his righteousness, he's a kind of advocate for those who are with him in the ark, even the animals. And Noah, being with Noah, meant salvation and protection. I think that is so important when it comes to our understanding of what it means that we are in Christ Jesus, that we are attached and grafted into him, that we are with him in the heavenly places seated. This has incredible implications on how we understand, not that we build our soteriology on this verse, but to say that, well, this actually seems to give us a better understanding of what it means to be in Christ and how that looks, how that historically played out pre-Jesus, and how that looks during Jesus' life and ministry. And then we go, is that how we can? There's some cool nuggets of wisdom I'll let you draw out from the text that you can find in the flood story. Also, for some reason, this portion of the flood story ends with what? 150 days, the waters prevailed. So if you think, wow, he's really emphasizing the waters prevailing here. I'm not. The text is. Over and over, the text wants to tell you the waters prevailed, as if to conquer and be strong against something. So why does this portion of the flood story end with one final mention of the waters prevailing? And the water prevails for 150 days, but the waters continue for 40 days. If you go back to verse 17, the waters continue. So what's the difference between the waters continuing and the waters prevailing? It seems like the waters are being released and increasing with almost like in an unstoppable way for 40 days. And then for 150 days total, the waters just remain present across the land. So just something to consider. Also here, Noah being left on the earth with those who were with him. makes him sound like and appear as a kind of Adam. I'm not going to say an Adam 2.0 because Jesus is the last Adam. He is the greater, perfect last Adam. But we can say Noah is a kind of Adam here in this story. But instead he'll be on a new earth. God starts over with Noah as a kind of Adam with his family and the animals in the floating Eden we call the ark. And then why 150 days? As it relates to what's happening, why this many days, what's the significance of that number? And then I'll end here in verse 24, the phrase with him or with Noah. You'll see that, here's how many times you'll see that just in this chapter. Verse 2, verse 7, verse 9, verse 13, and verse 15. Obviously, there's an emphasis on not just the prevailing waters, but in the midst of those prevailing, seemingly unstoppable floodwaters of destruction and death, there is one who you can be with to endure through the prevailing waters to the other side of life and a sort of new world that God has for his people. Hey, if you've enjoyed this study on Genesis 7, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts, questions, insights, connections to other texts, and even disagreements, as long as you voice those respectfully and lovingly, and be kind. And we will continue in our study of Genesis, Lord willing, next couple of days. You should see a video on Genesis chapter 8. But that's all I got for you on Genesis chapter 7. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts and your insights in the comments. If you want to share your thoughts and questions about these studies, join us every Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a live discussion together. And thank you for supporting this ministry. Your support helps us accomplish our mission, which is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. We're only able to make all of these free resources because of generous supporters like you. So thank you very much for all of your support. Make sure to visit abovereproachministry.com to check out all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.